Okay, we need to talk. Think of this as an urgent public service notice. It's a critical briefing based on an analysis of historical cycles, and according to our sources, events are already unfolding that point to extreme instability in our very near future. So, let's get right into it.
So, what the source analysis tells us is that the first 2 weeks of January 2026 are an absolute firestorm. At home, you've got federal agents clashing with protesters in Minneapolis, leading to fatal shootings and talk of invoking the Insurrection Act. At the exact same time, a huge diplomatic crisis over Greenland blows up, splintering old alliances like NATO. It's not one thing, it's a synchronized, multi-front breakdown.
And that brings us to the core question, right? Is this all just random bad luck? A series of disconnected events? Or is this the predictable culmination of a much larger pattern? Is there actually a hidden order to all this chaos?
To even begin to answer that, we have to look at the first layer of the model our sources use, and it's this idea that history isn't just a straight line of progress. Nope. Instead, it moves in predictable, repeating seasons. You know, seasons of growth, decay, and then rebirth. This whole framework is called the fourth turning.
Now, the fundamental unit of this cycle has a fancy name, a saeculum. Just think of it as one full revolution of history's seasons. It lasts about 80 to 100 years, which, not coincidentally, is about the length of a long human life. And that's key. It means that by the time one full cycle is complete, the generation that actually remembered the last great crisis, well, they're gone. And society is ready to repeat the pattern.
So within each of these cycles, you get 4 turnings or seasons. You start with a high, that's the spring, a post-crisis era where everyone's rebuilding and institutions are strong. Then comes the awakening, a summer of spiritual rebellion against that order. That's followed by the unraveling, an autumn where institutions are weak and individualism is king. And finally, you get the fourth turning, the crisis, the winter. This is where the old order collapses, often violently, and is replaced. According to this framework, the 2008 financial crash kicked us squarely into this final, most dangerous season.
And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. You can actually see it in the data. This chart maps the political regimes of France against these 4 turnings. See the red crisis periods? They line up almost perfectly with huge ruptures. The collapse of the First Republic, the 1848 Revolution, the fall of the Third Republic. It's like Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme.
Okay, so this leads to a really crucial question. If there are predictable seasons, there has to be a clock, right? A kind of metronome that sets the tempo for these 80 to 100-year cycles. So, what is it?
Well, the second layer of this analysis proposes an answer, and it's a big one, a celestial clockwork. But it's essential to understand how the sources are using this. This is not about fortune-telling, it's about mapping the rhythm of our system.
And this next point is absolutely critical. We're talking about correlation, not causation. The argument isn't that planets cause things to happen on Earth. Not at all. It's that the patterns of the solar system and the patterns of human social dynamics show this stunning similarity. Think of it like 2 perfectly synchronized clocks on a wall. One doesn't cause the other to tick, but they are both telling the same time.
And this isn't just pulled out of thin air. It actually lines up with a concept from science called sociological chaos theory. The idea is pretty simple. Really complex systems, like a whole society, are incredibly sensitive to their starting points, their initial conditions. In this framework, an astrological chart is just used as a symbolic map of those initial conditions. It's a snapshot of the system's inherent rhythm right at its birth.
And this chart, wow, this is where it gets really compelling. This overlays America's great historical crises with the 84-year orbit of the planet Uranus. The start of the Revolution, the Civil War, America's entry into World War II, they all happen when Uranus is moving through the same specific part of the sky. An 84-year planetary cycle and an 80 to 90-year historical cycle of crisis. That is one heck of a pattern.
So, with that model established, history moving in seasons, timed by a celestial clock, let's get back to our public service notice. Here is the specific forecast for the first quarter of 2026. What you're looking at here is a risk heat map for January through March of 2026. It's pretty straightforward. The darker the red, the higher the planetary stress on the US national chart, and therefore, the higher the probability of serious instability. After those initial shocks in early January, you can see the intensity just ramps up and up, peaking in late January and again in late February.
Okay, let's zero in on the 3 dates that are practically screaming off this chart. We've got January 27th, February 17th, and February 20th. According to this model, these are the key flashpoints where the risk of a major rupture is at its absolute highest. Let's break down why.
First up, January 27th, we have a Mars-Pluto conjunction. Now, in the symbolic language of this model, Mars represents aggression and violence. Pluto represents power, transformation, and, well, death. When they fuse together, the prediction is for something explosive, either a mass casualty event or a sudden, decisive, and overwhelming use of state military power.
Next, February 17th. This brings a solar eclipse. Think of it as a kind of cosmic reboot. But what's so critical here is that this eclipse lands directly on the part of the US's symbolic chart that represents the public, the people. The prediction? A major shock to public welfare. Something like a power grid failure or a total supply chain collapse.
And finally, on February 20th, we get what the sources are calling the most significant alignment of the decade, a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Symbolically, this is where Saturn, the planet of cold, hard reality, slams headfirst into Neptune, the planet of illusion, fantasy, and speculation. The predicted impact is what they're calling the collapse of the bubble, a massive financial crisis or the shattering of a shared belief system, where illusion finally meets a very harsh reality. So, after that incredibly intense forecast, what's the ultimate takeaway here? What are we supposed to do with this information about the coming great winter?
This risk profile here kind of pulls all the data points together into one picture, and you can see it plain as day. The risk scores for domestic instability and institutional collapse are pushing way past the critical threshold. All of these pressures we've been talking about, geopolitical, economic, social, they're all predicted to converge and peak in this very narrow window of time.
And that leads us to the final, really sobering conclusion from the source material. This fourth turning, this winter, isn't something to be stopped or avoided. It's a necessary season of destruction. The goal, according to the analysis, isn't to prevent the winter. It's to navigate it, to survive the storm. And that leaves us with this one last crucial question. If these cycles are real, and if a fourth turning always ends with the violent collapse of an old order to make way for a new one, then the most important question isn't how we stop the winter. It's what kind of world do we want to build when the spring finally arrives?
Okay, let's get into this. We're diving into a moment that our sources are calling the definitive onset of the climax.
Right, the climax of the millennial saeculum.
And specifically, this incredibly chaotic, synchronized rupture in the first 2 weeks of January 2026.
The chroniclers have a name for it. They're calling it the Winter of the Wolf.
That is a stark image. It has this sense of hunger, cold, imminent danger.
It really does. And our mission today, I think, is crucial. Because if you were just watching the news then, you would have seen what looked like 3 totally disconnected crises all happening at once.
Right, a total information overload.
Exactly. You had a major diplomatic, really a military breakdown in the Arctic. At the same time, you have urban warfare essentially erupting in Minneapolis.
And then this completely bizarre cultural spectacle down in Florida, powdered wigs, animal masks, just surreal.
To the casual observer, it was just overwhelming random noise, chaos.
And that's where we step in. Because the central premise of this whole deep dive is that there's a unified architecture underneath all that noise. These events weren't random at all.
No, they were, according to the framework we're using, the synchronized rupture of a single system under extreme pressure.
So the source material breaks this down into those 3 theaters.
3 simultaneous theaters, yeah. The geopolitical one, which is all centered around the Greenland annexation crisis.
The domestic one, the breakdown of order we saw in what's being called the Battle of Minneapolis.
And then that cultural flashpoint, the surreal scene at Mar-a-Lago. We really have to move beyond just the headlines to see the deep chronology here.
And to understand the why and the when of it all, we're using 2 really powerful frameworks that might seem totally unrelated at first.
But when you fuse them, they provide incredible predictive power. That's the core of the analysis. We're integrating the Strauss-Howe generational theory.
The sociological cycles, the societal heartbeat, you could say.
Exactly, and we're pairing that with mundane astrology,
Right.
Specifically using the Fagan-Bradley sidereal zodiac. That's our celestial clockwork. It gives us the precise timing.
So our goal for you, the listener, is to see that this chaos isn't arbitrary. It's not just a series of bad political decisions or random outbursts.
It is, and I'm quoting the source here, the predictable unfolding of a cosmic geometry.
And that geometry, it relies on this fundamental idea that history moves in these long repeating cycles.
These 80 to 90-year cycles called secula, and we've known we were in the fourth turning, the crisis era, since the financial collapse of 2008.
But this, January 2026, this is different. This is a phase shift.
It's the shift into its most kinetic, most dangerous, most explosive phase. It's what the sources are calling the hardening.
That distinction is so important. Moving from just being in the crisis to entering the hardening, it sounds like acceleration.
It is acceleration. The crisis era demands total institutional destruction and then eventually a painful rebirth. And that process, it inherently requires profound conflict.
And a total reversal of cultural values.
The total reversal. It demands that community survival and authority get prioritized over the radical individualism that defined the last few decades. The celestial clock, as we're about to see, confirms the exact timing of this violent transition.
Okay, so let's start there with the sociological clock, the Strauss-Howe theory. It gives us the context, the cultural mood that allowed all this to happen at once. For anyone who needs a quick refresher, can you walk us through the four turnings?
Of course. Think of them as seasons in a long historical year. The cycle always begins with the high. That's the spring.
Post-World War II America.
A perfect example. It's an era of incredible institutional strength, high trust, optimism. Civic order is deeply ingrained. Everybody basically knows their role in the system.
But that rigidity, that conformity, it always creates a backlash.
It always does. Which brings us to the awakening, the summer. This is a period of spiritual upheaval, a rebellion against that established order. You get this massive surge in individualism.
In the 1960s and 70s.
Exactly. People start prioritizing their authentic self, their internal moral compass, over what the institutions are telling them.
And that flows directly into the third season, the unraveling. I think a lot of us remember this one pretty clearly.
The unraveling is the autumn. It's defined by cynicism, institutional decay. Trust just hits rock bottom.
And everything fragments.
Totally. The culture becomes highly individualistic, pragmatic. Politics becomes a kind of performance art. That period lasted roughly from the early 80s until the big shock of 2008. The system was just slowly rusting out.
And that shock, 2008, that's what kicked us into the winter. The crisis, the fourth turning, where we are now.
This is the season of destruction and ultimately rebirth. Institutional life, having been totally weakened during the unraveling, is now torn down and rebuilt from the foundations up.
Always in response to some kind of perceived existential threat.
Right, usually economic or military. And this current crisis, our source material suggests, is on track to resolve somewhere around 2030 to 2032.
But the key insight here, for understanding 2026, is the demand of the crisis. It flips everything on its head.
Absolutely. The core demand of this winter is the polar opposite of the unraveling's individualism. The crisis demands community, authority, collective sacrifice.
Like the mobilization for World War II.
A perfect historical parallel. Personal freedoms, consumerism, all of that was instantly sidelined for the sake of the collective war effort. The chaos we saw in January 2026 is the sound of the system screaming as it tries to force that same kind of sociological shift.
Okay, that gives us the 80-year roadmap, the long arc. Now let's get to the celestial roadmap, which is much more precise about the timing of these inflection points. This is where we bring in the sidereal zodiac.
Right.
Most people know their sun sign, tropical astrology. Why is this specific system, the Fagan-Bradley system, so critical for looking at national timelines?
That's a great question, and it's really the difference between using a sundial and an atomic clock. The popular tropical zodiac is tied to the seasons. When the sun enters the sign of Aries, spring begins. Simple.
But the Earth wobbles.
Exactly. The Earth wobbles on its axis over thousands of years. It's called precession. So the seasons slowly drift backward against the backdrop of the actual fixed constellations.
So your normal zodiac sign is based on the Earth's seasonal tilt, which is always changing relative to the rest of the galaxy.
Precisely. So if you want a fixed historical reference point, especially when you're comparing events that are centuries apart, you have to use the sidereal zodiac. The Fagan-Bradley system corrects for that precession. It tracks the planets against the actual fixed stars.
And for mundane astrology, the study of nations, that gives you a reliable historical clock.
It's the only one that works, really.
So when you apply that clock, that precision, to the birth chart of the United States, the Sibley chart from 1776, It changes everything.
It radically changes the nation's core identity. It's probably the most stunning finding in the sources. The standard tropical chart gives the U.S. this optimistic, philosophical, world-traveling Sagittarius ascendant.
Which feels a little bit right,
Yeah.
but not entirely.
Not entirely. When you apply the Fagan-Bradley correction, the nation's core identity, its projected face to the world, gets rectified to a sidereal Scorpio ascendant, specifically around 20 degrees.
That is a profound shift in personality. Scorpio is intense. It's about transformation, power, destruction.
It tells us the American experience is inherently volatile. It's intense, it's often violent. Scorpio is the archetype of regeneration, of death and rebirth.
The phoenix rising from the ashes.
Literally, a nation with this martial scorpionic ascendant, which is ruled by the planet Mars, the god of war, it doesn't evolve through gentle compromise. It has to evolve through catastrophic crises. It has to die to its old form to be reborn stronger.
Wait a minute, so the whole concept of the fourth turning destruction followed by total reconstruction.
Is literally built into the nation's celestial DNA.
The two clocks are telling the exact same story.
Exactly. Crisis isn't a bug in the American system. It's the scheduled feature for regeneration.
Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road. If this framework is correct, there has to be a specific, repeatable signature for America's most destructive moments.
And there is.
Let's talk about the planetary pacemaker of the crisis. Uranus in sidereal Taurus.
This is the single most compelling piece of evidence in the whole model. Uranus, the planet of shock, revolution, sudden change. It has an 84-year orbital cycle.
Which almost perfectly mirrors the 80 to 90-year seculum. It's the natural cycle marker.
And when Uranus transits through the sign of sidereal Taurus, the sign that rules land, resources, money, stability, it acts as the war signature in the U.S. chart.
Why specifically in that sign?
Because Taurus occupies the U.S. 7th house, the house of open enemies, but also of treaties and partnerships. So when the planet of sudden, shattering change enters the house of partners and the fight is over land and resources,
The partnership shatters. It leads to conflict.
and the historical correlation is, frankly, stunning. It's mathematically precise.
So lay it out for us.
Every single time Uranus has transited sidereal Taurus, the nation has gone through an existential conflict over sovereignty, land, and resources. It coincided precisely with the Revolutionary War,
Breaking the partnership with the UK.
the Civil War,
Breaking the partnership between the states.
and World War II.
Breaking and totally reforming the global alliance structure. We are in this exact signature again, 2024 to 2032.
The celestial clock is confirming that this crisis isn't just political, it's existential. It is demanding a total reformation of our partnerships and our relationship to material reality. And you have to hold this war signature in your mind as we now go back to the 3 ruptures of January 2026.
Right, with that framework in place, let's audit the events themselves. Starting with the geopolitical rupture, the Greenland annexation crisis. This feels like the clearest manifestation of that Uranus and Taurus war signature.
It's a textbook case. The crisis immediately confirms the astrological themes. Territory, resources, land, pure Taurus energy. And this wasn't some, throwback to 19th century expansionism. The core driver was strategic necessity.
The Golden Dome.
The Trump administration's Golden Dome missile defense architecture, it's this comprehensive shield designed specifically to counter Russia and China's new hypersonic glide vehicles.
Which are almost impossible to stop with existing systems.
Right, and military strategists determined that Greenland's geography is indispensable for this to work. You need its land to position the radars and interceptors to close what they call the Arctic Gap.
So the island went from being a curiosity to a non-negotiable strategic asset.
Overnight, which crucially shifted the entire diplomatic posture. It went from a half-joking offer to purchase Greenland to a hardline stance of acquisition by necessity.
And that led to the total collapse of the January 13th summit.
A catastrophic collapse. The Danish foreign minister, Rasmussen, he didn't mince words, he publicly accused President Trump of having a naked wish of conquering the island.
And the U.S. position was just as blunt.
Chillingly clear. It basically boiled down to, we need Greenland for national security. Consensus is a luxury we don't have. If we don't secure it, Russia and China will.
And here's where we see the immediate, violent fulfillment of that Uranus in the 7th house prediction.
The dissolution of NATO. For the first time in the alliance's history, European members mobilized military forces not to support the U.S., but to deter it.
The partnership shattering in real time.
It wasn't just diplomatic outrage either. This was kinetic. A coalition, France, Germany, Sweden, Norway, and critically, the UK, they announced the deployment of personnel to Nuuk.
For the Arctic Endurance exercise, I believe it was called.
A very diplomatic name for what was essentially establishing a tripwire force. They were openly trying to deter U.S. aggression. It confirmed that America's key allies now viewed it as a rogue hegemon.
And of course, Moscow was just sitting back and watching all this unfold.
And playing it perfectly. They positioned themselves as the rational observers, accusing both sides of irresponsibly militarizing the Arctic. It was a huge diplomatic victory for them, achieved just by watching the Western alliance eat itself.
So the result is this incredibly volatile standoff. Greenland is now, maybe, the most dangerous piece of real estate on the planet.
Absolutely. You have this hair-trigger three-way situation, the reinforced U.S. base at Pituffik, the European tripwire force in Nuuk, and Russia's military posture encroaching all around them. That is the Seventh House War, with partners activated over resources in real time.
Now let's shift focus inward to the simultaneous domestic rupture,
Yeah.
the Battle of Minneapolis. This shows the other side of the coin, the internal breakdown of the federal monopoly on violence.
Right. This is a key hallmark of that transition into the hardening.
And it started not with a bang, but with this massive federal creep.
Exactly. In late 2025, DHS initiated Operation Metro Surge. They flooded the Twin Cities with over 2,000 federal agents, mostly from ICE and CBP.
Which is, what, 5 times the size of the local police force?
At least. They were using militarized tactics from day one. Armored vehicles, chemical irritants, drones. It was an undeniable pressure cooker.
The scale alone seems intended to be overwhelming, a pure display of federal power.
It was meant to be crushing. But the spark that lit the fuse, the thing that stripped the whole operation of any legitimacy, was the fatal shooting of a U.S. citizen, Renee Nicole Good, on January 7th.
Shot by an ICE agent during a traffic stop.
And the reaction from local leadership was immediate and furious. Governor Walz, Mayor Frey, they completely rejected the federal narrative of self-defense. Walz called it a campaign of organized brutality.
He demanded their immediate withdrawal.
Positioning the state directly against the federal government, the killing of a citizen instantly transformed a protest movement into a localized resistance.
And then the confrontation turned kinetic. Fast.
Very fast. A week later, January 14th, an ICE officer was shot. DHS called it an ambush. But the most critical escalation, the thing that really validates this hardening phase, was the weapons heist.
This is the breach of the state's authority you mentioned.
This is it. Anti-ICE elements carried out a coordinated raid, seizing a substantial amount of federal arms and munitions from secured vehicles. Wow. This means the resistance moved beyond just street protest. It became hardened, strategic, militarized. They were now literally armed with the state's own weapons.
And this leads directly to the constitutional brinkmanship that defined the end of January.
Absolutely. The conflict went to the highest levels. Minnesota's AG, Keith Ellison, sued the federal government to halt the operation. And in response, President Trump threatened the nuclear option.
The Insurrection Act of 1807.
Invoking that act allows the president to deploy active-duty military troops on American streets to suppress a rebellion, completely bypassing the governor's consent.
It's the ultimate red line in American domestic politics.
It is the ultimate fourth turning marker, the collapse of the posse comitatus norm, the full militarization of domestic politics. The social contract was at its breaking point.
Okay, finally the third rupture, the cultural one. The surreal decay of Mar-a-Lago. This one is less about kinetic force and more about something else.
It's about the profound dissociation of the ruling class from the national reality. It is the perfect historical parallel.
Let them eat cake.
It's exactly that. While Minneapolis was burning and we were on the brink of war in the Arctic, the cultural flashpoint was viral videos of a New Year's Eve party at Mar-a-Lago.
Dubbed the furry ball online.
The furry ball, yes. And you have to understand the specific imagery to get why it was so potent. The videos showed entertainers, high society figures in these incredibly elaborate 18th century Rococo court costumes. Powdered wigs, velvet coats, the whole thing.
Mimicking the court of Versailles.
Perfectly. But the crucial, bizarre detail was that instead of human faces, they were all wearing these uncanny, hyper-realistic, high-end dog masks. And they were dancing, completely oblivious to an ironic remix of Let Them Eat Cake.
That is just dissociation rendered into spectacle.
It is the ultimate symptom. It highlights the profound cultural dissociation of the elite. They were engaged in this hermetic, surreal fantasy while the country was literally fracturing.
So it wasn't just a weird party. It was a historical echo, an omen.
A powerful omen. The image of the dog aristocrats dancing in those gilded halls evokes the pre-revolutionary atmosphere of 1789 France. The court was utterly divorced from the suffering of the masses. It's the perfect astrological signature of Pluto dismantling the ancient regime power, completely insulated in a bubble of luxury, totally unable to see the consequences of its own actions.
Okay, we've laid out the 3 ruptures. Now let's use the U.S. sidereal Scorpio rising chart to prove this isn't random, that it's all synchronized by the celestial geometry. Let's start with Greenland. How did Uranus activate the war code?
The Greenland crisis is the clearest signature of the war activation. In January 2026, the planet Uranus was at about 27 degrees of sidereal Taurus.
And that matters because?
Because that degree is tightly conjunct to the U.S. natal Mars, the planet of war, which sits at 28 degrees of Taurus. And both are located in the 7th house of the chart, a house of partners and open enemies.
So let's break down that equation. Uranus is shock and revolution. Mars is aggression and war. Taurus is land and resources. And it's all happening in the house of partners.
It is a literal and chilling description of the crisis. This is the exact geometric configuration that signifies a nation asserting aggressive dominance over a partner Denmark, over an issue of land Greenland. The mobilization of troops against an ally is the Uranian severance of that alliance.
The moment the 4th turning went from theory to kinetic reality on the global stage.
Precisely.
Okay, moving inward to Minneapolis. The pressure cooker there was driven by that massive Capricorn stellium.
Correct. You have to remember, the 3rd house in a nation's chart governs the immediate environment. The streets, local policing, neighbors.
Local sphere.
And in mid-January, a huge concentration of planets, the Sun, Mars, Mercury, Venus, all moved into sidereal Capricorn. And for the U.S. Scorpio rising chart, Capricorn rules that 3rd house.
So all the planetary focus just shifts from the global stage to the streets at home.
And the geometry is so precise. Mars entered Capricorn, a sign where it is astrologically exalted.
Meaning it's at its strongest.
Its greatest possible strength and discipline. Mars in Capricorn indicates the state's use of force will be heavy, crushing, and strategic. This is a perfect description of the ICE surge. 2,000 agents, armored vehicles, overwhelming the local sphere with maximum state authority.
And the timing with the sun.
The sun, which represents the executive focus, entered Capricorn on January 14th. That's the moment the president's attention shifted entirely to the domestic sphere, and the Insurrection Act threat became real.
But exalted Mars isn't just about state power. The resistance also got more strategic.
That's the duality. Exalted Mars empowers force no matter who's wielding it. If the state's force becomes disciplined and heavy, the resistance is forced to become equally strategic just to survive. The weapons theft is the perfect expression of that.
Now for the bizarre part, Mar-a-Lago Ball. How does the celestial geometry explain the elite retreating into that level of denial?
That is the Neptunian delusion mechanism. Neptune is transiting sidereal Pisces, which is its home sign. Its influence is at maximum strength.
And Pisces rules which house for the U.S.?
The 5th house. The house of entertainment, luxury, high society, speculation.
So Neptune, the planet of illusion, masks, and fantasy, is at full power in the house of elite parties.
It acts as a powerful psychological escape. It creates a surreal, disconnected fantasy, a Neptunian veil that completely obscures the violent reality happening in the 3rd house in Minneapolis. It's a total psychic split, where the reality of violence is dissolved by a collective fantasy of gilded privilege.
And what about the flashpoint itself? The shooting of Renee Good on January 7th.
The daily transits line up. That specific date coincided with a highly volatile conjunction. Venus conjunct Mars in sidereal Sagittarius.
Venus is passion, Mars is aggression.
And Sagittarius is the sign of ideology and moral righteousness. So you get this immediate, passionate conflict fueled by fiery ideological conviction on both sides. A rapid, destructive burst of energy.
What's so striking about all this is that the U.S. crisis wasn't happening in a vacuum. Our sources point to a global synchronization.
A rare convergence, yeah. The 3 outer planets that define historical eras, Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus, are all shifting into fire or air signs between 2025 and 2026.
A cosmic shifting of gears.
It guarantees the crisis is global. The major world powers are all hitting their existential rock bottom at the same time.
Let's start with China. They're also in a 4th turning, but the dynamic is completely different.
Fundamentally different. The PRC chart is rectified to a sidereal Capricorn ascendant. Capricorn is all about hierarchy, rigid structure, control. So while the U.S. crisis is centrifugal, tearing the nation apart,
China's is centripetal.
exactly, forcing inward, the entire goal of their cycle is maximal consolidation to prevent fracture. The state believes the only way to survive is absolute control.
And we see the symptom of that in this passive youth rebellion.
The lying flat and let it rot movements, it's a kind of nihilistic decoupling. The social contract was always sacrifice your present for future prosperity. But when that promise is broken,
And youth unemployment hits 20%.
before they just stopped releasing the data, the youth rationally choose to withdraw their energy. They're refusing to be fuel for the state's engine. It's a powerful passive resistance.
And China is also hitting its astrological climax in this 2025-2026 window.
It is. Transiting Pluto, the planet of death and transformation, is crossing the PRC's natal ascendant in Capricorn right now.
For a nation, that's the most intense transit possible.
It is a moment of maximum danger. It signifies a total metamorphosis of the nation's identity. Historically, that means either a massive internal purge or a sudden shift to a total war economy, a complete identity reset.
Now let's jump over to the UK. Their identity crisis has been obvious for a while, but 2026 is forecasted to be their dark night of the soul.
The UK chart we use from 1066 gives it a Martial Sagittarius sun and Aries ascendant, an imperial identity.
And its crisis trigger was Brexit.
Perfectly synchronized. Pluto conjoined the UK's natal sun in 2019-2020, right as Brexit happened. It was the 248-year death and rebirth of the nation's sovereignty. It chose to destroy its old European partnership.
So if Brexit was the start of the crisis, what makes 2026 so bad?
It's the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in February 2026. This conjunction happens in sidereal Pisces, and it falls directly on the UK's natal moon.
And in mundane astrology, the moon is.
The moon represents the common people, the populace, the public mood, food supplies.
So when Saturn, the planet of hardship and reality, and Neptune, the planet of dissolution and confusion, hit the moon of the people.
It predicts immense social suffering, a sense of total institutional abandonment. You're talking about the collapse of social safety nets like the NHS, mass disillusionment, and maximum danger to the integrity of the Union itself.
Scotland.
Scotland's secession pressures would reach their peak kinetic force right in this window. It's an economic, structural, and emotional rock bottom.
And this brings it all back home, because that same conjunction links the fate of the US and the UK.
This is the special relationship reset. That Saturn-Neptune conjunction is hitting the USIC, the foundation of the chart, the homeland. At the exact same time it hits the UK moon, the soul of its people.
So both nations are having a foundational crisis at the exact same moment.
The prediction is that the special relationship fundamentally shifts. It moves away from joint global power projection and becomes about mutual survival and recovery. Both states will be forced to look inward at their own collapse.
And it's happening in Aquarius, the sign of technology, networks, infrastructure.
The most likely manifestation is a major cyber warfare event, a grid outage that paralyzes a city, or a massive data breach that collapses institutional trust.
This sounds like the perfect justification for the executive to finally invoke the Insurrection Act.
Exactly. This kind of destructive rupture provides the perfect existential threat to justify suspending civil liberties and shifting the nation to a state of martial law.
Then we move into February and the eclipse window, the cosmic circuit breaker.
A moment of deep structural shock. On February 17th, there's a solar eclipse that lands directly on the U.S. natal moon in Aquarius.
An eclipse hitting the national moon. What does that warn of?
A deep collective shock to the public sense of safety. It can be a public health crisis, a massive supply chain failure, or just a moment where the people feel completely abandoned by the state. A traumatic collective experience.
And 3 days later, the economic hammer drops.
On February 20th, we get that Saturn-Neptune conjunction in sidereal Pisces. This is the signature for the collapse of the bubble.
Reality meets illusion.
And the virtual economy, which has been sustained by fantasy, hits the hard wall of reality. You can expect a massive instantaneous correction in speculative assets, crypto, tech stocks. More chillingly, it predicts a profound liquidity crisis in the global bond market. The debt-based system is dissolving.
Which brings us back to the overriding theme of this entire fourth turning, the economic revolution driven by Uranus and Taurus.
That's the signal in the noise. Uranus and Taurus guarantees this crisis is fundamentally about resources, tangible things, food, energy, land. The instability will force a structural devaluation of fiat currency. Debt dissolves and tangible value ascends.
So how does the technocratic state try to control that revolution?
By capturing it. The instability provides the perfect justification for radical intervention. The state will try to accelerate the push for central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, in 2026. It's an attempt to enforce digital control over the very domain of value that Uranus is trying to revolutionize.
And finally, looking ahead to April, the final shift.
The final step to total war. In late April 2026, Uranus moves into its tightest possible alignment with the U.S. natal Mars and the 7th house cusp.
The war signature goes critical.
The energy shifts from internal security to a direct external kinetic conflict with a peer adversary, China or Russia. This signals the definitive end of the Cold War phase of this crisis and the beginning of the hot war phase.
So what does this all mean? We've audited Greenland, Minneapolis, Mar-a-Lago, and they're not random noise. They're the predictable unfolding of these deep cycles.
It means the era of politics, of negotiation and compromise is definitively over. The era of force has arrived, and it's guided by the fixed clockwork of these sidereal cycles. The institutions designed for the last cycle, NATO, the Fed, the social contract, they can't hold.
And our sources are pretty blunt about the future of American governance.
The U.S. federal government, in its current form, is statistically and astrologically unlikely to survive the seculum. The pressure is just too immense. A radical constitutional or territorial restructuring is projected for that 2026-2028 window. The system is scheduled for a total reboot.
What's the final thought you want to leave the listener with?
It's this. The sources suggest the coming civil war won't be fought on traditional battlefields. It will be fought in the friction of the third house.
The neighborhood. The checkpoint on the highway.
The blackout of the data grid. The task is no longer to prevent the crisis. The winter of the wolf is already here. The task for every individual is to navigate the coming destruction with enough clarity and resourcefulness to ensure that the spring, when it finally comes around 2032, finds a civilization worth inheriting. That is the true challenge of surviving the hardening.